I timed the moment by the sound of water leaving the sky and tapping the metal lip of the downspout, a clean metronome for a week that stopped being ordinary the second a bright yellow tag appeared on my front gate. 48 hours. Remove the barrels or pay $200 per barrel, per day, until I cured the violation. The tag's words were dry where the rain couldn't reach them, as if dryness itself gave them authority. I stared at the numbers etched like a countdown and felt the cold shape of a deadline settle behind my ribs, heavier than the clouds. The board had turned my simple plan, harvest rain, water the shared native beds, keep runoff off the sidewalks, into a clock I couldn't ignore. And if I missed that clock, the treasurer said fines could escalate into a lien, and the shame of it would stick around long after the puddles dried. I swallowed, counted the barrels like guilty witnesses, and told myself I would not fold in 48 hours. There was more at stake than plastic drums and a tiny patch of kale. Before this, I thought I understood the game. The complex sold itself as eco-friendly, the kind of place where the brochures showed butterfly milkweed around mailbox clusters and kids in bright ponchos marching under stormy skies. We had a sustainability committee on our website banner, a leaf-shaped icon next to the calendar, and a line about community gardens that the real estate agent practically sang. I believed all of it, or enough to order 2 gray barrels with tight lids and mosquito screens. When the first summer shower hit their surfaces, the sound was joyful in a way I hadn't expected, like applause. The water smelled faintly of dust and then of nothing at all, and I carried the first bucket out to the shared prairie strip that runs along our parking court. I didn't need a lecture on conservation, the land spoke softly if you listened. But then the tag. Then the timer. Then a line in small print that said, CCCR Section 4.3. I pulled my binder of governing documents from the kitchen shelf and found that section highlighted by a previous owner's careful hand. Prohibited exterior modifications included cisterns or water storage devices visible from common areas. I stared at the phrase and at the date scrawled on the lower right corner of my printed copy, 6 years ago, and I felt a pulse of heat in my cheeks. 6 years is a long time for rules about water. There was a new state law that had started showing up in articles and homeowner forums, one that encouraged capture systems and set basic standards. I had bookmarked a summary, and the words floated up now like a lifeline. The association might think it could write time in reverse, but it couldn't erase the moment we were living in. I told myself I would not just defend the barrels, I would hold up the mission we were sold and force them to see the contradiction. I didn't know then how far some people would go to protect a line of text. I didn't know how quickly a neighbor could turn into a censor. But I knew this, 48 hours is not a sprint, it's a race with strategy. The board wanted speed. I wanted truth. I set the tag on the counter, wiped the rain from my sleeve, and planned my first move while the downspout kept counting the seconds with a gentle drip. The background of our complex looks green on paper. We have bioswales where the lawn ends, native grasses that ripple like a low wave when the wind slides between the townhome rows, and a page on the website with a glossy PDF about stormwater management. That PDF is my first evidence prop, an agenda excerpt for a board meeting last spring, where sustainability updates sat on line 3 below, pool gate repairs. The excerpt bragged about reduced irrigation costs due to community conservation efforts, a phrase I clung to because it aligned with my quiet buckets and a pair of simple barrels. If the association claimed conservation in glossy lines, how could it find me for the most basic version of it? The board president, Mr. K in my mental notes, likes clean angles and sharper emails. He lives on the corner unit by the mailbox kiosk and never lets a parcel sit there longer than an hour. He talks about uniformity in the newsletter and about property values in conversations he pretends are friendly. The treasurer is quieter, careful, the type who will say a decision is final in one sentence and then invite questions in the next. They aren't villains, they're functionaries in a system that likes to see itself as tidy. But tidiness is not the same as right. The tag on my gate didn't care about native grasses or the language of conservation. It cared about the shape of a cylinder in the sightline of a walkway. When I first emailed the management company about the barrels months ago, the coordinator sent a polite acknowledgement and no follow-up. It wasn't approval, not formally, but it wasn't a rejection either. The barrels became part of the background like a stray planter, until someone decided they weren't. I can guess who flagged it. There's a neighbor 2 doors down who treats our shared rules like a personal script. She doesn't like anything that breaks the scene she imagines we live in. In my head I call her the committee of one. When her porch fern browned, she sent 3 messages about watering schedules, but when the rain stung our windows last week, she moved her cushions inside and let the storm sluice off the roof as if water had no destination. The thing about rules is that they don't live in binders, they live in people. A line like CCR Section 4.3 is harmless until it's used like a tool. I found a second evidence prop in my files. Final notice sent to a friend on the other side of the court, dated May 12 last year, warning that a trellis installed without approval had to be removed. The notice used the same phrasing and the same stern footer about potential liens. It had a mail log attached, the mailbox rule, they call it, CCR Section 4.3's quiet cousin, stating that notice is presumed delivered 3 days after mailing. The association is fluent in deadlines. I was about to learn the dialect. I tell you all this because the setup matters. The complex markets itself as a friend to the planet, the board acts like a friend to the handbook. Somewhere between those two friendships is a war over symbols. My barrels became a symbol the minute the tag went on the gate. And if the symbol could be punished, then so could the people who read the word eco-friendly and believed it. I took a breath by the back door and let the cold, damp air slip in, so I'd remember what this felt like in my chest, not just in my head. I gathered my binder, snapped a photo of the tag, and circled the due date on my wall calendar in red. 48 hours meant 2 evenings and a workday. Not much time to argue, barely enough to organize. Still, I had tools, the agenda excerpt, the final notice template, the mailbox rule, and the new state laws summary I'd saved. I didn't need to be a lawyer. I needed to be stubborn and precise. I also needed to think about the optics. The treasurer liked optics. The president liked consistency. If I could show them a version of consistency that included barrels, maybe they would blink. Or maybe they would push back harder. Either way, the clock had already started. The first minor skirmish began with the sky, which cleared overnight and left the barrels half full, lids tight, screens clean. I walked the row at dawn, listened to the sparrows gossip on the fence, and took note of small details that would matter later, which downspouts spilled across the sidewalk, which mulch beds were eroding, which hose bibs dripped. I took photos, time-stamped and boring, the kind that make people roll their eyes until they need them. The association likes to say it protects property values. I like to prove I protect the property. This is not a fight about color schemes. It is about water, and whether we treat it like a nuisance or a resource. I started with email, measured and calm. I wrote to the management coordinator and copied the board address listed in the handbook. I attached the agenda excerpt and asked for clarification on how conservation fits the visual uniformity clause. I included a screenshot from the state's website summarizing the new water law that encourages residential rain capture and sets standards for screening and placement. I used phrases the board likes: safety, consistency, community benefit, and asked for a temporary stay on enforcement while we reviewed the policy in light of the new law. I wasn't trying to win in one message. I was trying to move the battlefield from my gate to a conversation about what the complex says it stands for. The reply came fast and formal, a shape I recognized. The coordinator acknowledged receipt and said enforcement remained in place pending board review. There was no date for that review. There was no pause in the countdown. I checked the time on my phone and felt the deadline like a string pulled tighter. I needed to change the terrain. If this stayed one resident versus a clause, I would lose. If it became the community versus a contradiction, I had a chance. I walked out to the shared garden strip where the prairie plants hunkered down for spring growth. We had bluestem and coneflower and a stubborn bunch of milkweed that kept its promise year after year. I watered them lightly from the barrel's spigot, a quiet act that felt like both care and defiance. Then I took another set of photos, water contained, no puddling, clean lids. I uploaded the images to a folder I titled Stormwater Evidence, because even petty fights deserve proper names. The next step was simple: share the folder in the residents' forum with a short note about the tag, the deadline, and the fact that the association's sustainability claims were about to collide with my plastic drums. That post cracked something open. Replies appeared in the hour between breakfast and commute. Some were the usual suggestions about form submissions and rules. But others were sharper and kinder. One person wrote about drought cycles and the city's seasonal water rates. Another brought up a grant the city offered 2 years ago for rain gardens and capture barrels. Someone else mentioned that our insurance premiums were partly tied to stormwater compliance. I wasn't alone. The green brochure hadn't lied to everyone, it had recruited us. Now the association had to reconcile the brochure with enforcement, or it would look exactly like what it was, a body that liked green talk until green touched the landscape. The treasurer posted a comment later that morning. It was careful and free of specifics, the way these things go. The comment said the board was aware of concerns and would review policy. It reminded everyone that external fixtures require approval. It thanked the community for its input. It did not extend my deadline. The clock kept ticking. By midday, I had a plan that fit in my pocket: print the state law summary, bring the agenda excerpt, and draft a one-page request for a temporary enforcement hold pending policy alignment. I scheduled a short open deck meeting on the Forum Green for that evening. I brought a stack of flyers with a headline that matched the board's language: "Let's align conservation with consistency." I wasn't staging a protest. I was staging a mirror. If we said we were eco-friendly, we had to look like it. A few neighbors joined in that late-day light when shadows make our townhome rows look taller. We walked the strip together and pointed to where water always pooled after a storm. We talked, not in quotes but in a chorus, about what counted as visible clutter and what counted as common sense. I held up the agenda excerpt and the final notice template, evidence props like cards in a game that had rules whether the board liked it or not. The air tasted like damp earth and the clean metallic tang of a recent storm. I told everyone the truth: if the board insisted on fines, I would pay the first one and appeal the rest, and I would do it loudly, with receipts. It wasn't bravado. It was strategy. When I got home, there was a letter in my mailbox, postmarked 2 days earlier but arriving now, a printed copy of the violation notice with the same deadline. The mailbox rule had entered the chat. I ran my finger under the line that presumed delivery and counted the days again. The board's calendar and mine did not match. If I accepted theirs, I had fewer hours than I thought. If I challenged it, I needed a reason stronger than shock. I set the letter beside the tag on my counter and took a photo of them together, because paper can look like power until you put it under a lens. The second day dawned clear and bright, and with it came tiny new cracks. A neighbor sent me photos of a decorative rain chain at the clubhouse that had been installed last year without a formal submission. It was on the board's own building, and it fed a small barrel hidden behind shrubs. The barrel wasn't visible from the main path, but it existed. I added the photo to my folder. The treasurer posted a note that the board would hold a special discussion at the next meeting. That meeting, according to the posted calendar, was 6 days away. My deadline was 1 day away. The gap was the point. The association didn't have to change the rules to make this right. It just had to stop the clock until the rules could be read in the present tense. I drafted my request for a temporary hold in firm, steady lines. I cited the agenda excerpt and the posted sustainability language. I referenced the state's summary without pretending to interpret it like a court. I included the photos of contained water and clean lids. I asked for empathy in the language the treasurer uses: optics, alignment, mission. I finished with a single line of steel, written without heat: I would comply with any outcome that was honestly consistent with our stated values and with current law, and I would expect the board to do the same. Then I attached the request to an email and sent it to the coordinator with the board copied, time-stamped and logged. By late afternoon, the response arrived: no stay. The violation stood. The barrels had to go by noon the next day or fines would begin. The message ended with a suggestion that I remove them for now and reapply after the policy review. That phrase, "for now," landed like a door closing right before you reach it. If I removed the barrels, I would give them the optics of compliance. If I left them, I would be labeled defiant, then fined, then shamed. The choice was the trap. I poured a cup of coffee and stared at the rain chain photo from the clubhouse. Then I looked at the calendar again and noticed something I'd missed. The board meeting date was posted, but the agenda wasn't. According to our bylaws, special enforcement topics require advance notice on the agenda. I checked the handbook and found the line, tucked into a paragraph about transparency. The agenda had to be posted at least 48 hours before the meeting. I smiled. A small hook in a big fish. If they wanted to discuss rain capture, they would have to post it, and once they posted it, I could attach my request in the comments under the agenda item. It wouldn't stop the fines, but it would attach my words to their record. Evidence prop number 3 would become Board Agenda Excerpt Part 2, with my notes stapled in the digital margins. Sometimes the only way to change a script is to write in the margins and force the actors to improvise. Hook. The deadline is still coming, but the agenda clock is now running alongside it. If the board blinks on process, I'll hit pause on their punishment and turn their own rules into a spotlight. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing the downspouts' empty echo and seeing the yellow tag in the dark. But when morning came, a light mist hung over the parking court and made the shrubs shine. I took the barrels off their stands, rolled them to the back corner of my patio where they still connected to the downspout but sat behind the privacy screen you can see only from one angle. They were still visible from common areas. Technically, if you squinted, they were also less obvious. I snapped a photo and added it to my growing album with a caption that said, "Mitigation, not capitulation." This was a chessboard, not a tug-of-war. If I could buy hours without surrendering, I would. Then I drafted one more message for the residents' forum. I kept it short and factual: the deadline, the lack of a stay, the plan to speak at the meeting, and the presence of that little clubhouse barrel behind the shrubs. I reminded folks there was a difference between clutter and function. I ended with a simple ask: if you believe we should live up to our own green promises, come to the meeting or post a comment under the agenda when it appears. I hit send and watched the thread lift gently, like a kite catching a breeze. By noon, the first fine would hit if I didn't remove the barrels. I looked at them, at the places where the plastic met the threaded brass spigot, at the tidy screens, at the water that waited. I thought about the optics I'd hand the board if I broke under their clock. And I thought about the optics they'd hand me if they fined the person watering the native beds with rain while their own rain chain fed a hidden drum. If I was going to carry a label into the next meeting, I preferred the word stubborn over the word surrender. I left the barrels where they stood and set my phone alarm for 12:15, because I wanted to know exactly when the fine arrived. The mist thinned. The sun came through. In the quiet, you could hear the small sound of water in the downspout shifting as it cooled. I waited with that sound in my ears and the sight of the yellow tag in my mind, and I promised myself that if noon brought punishment, the afternoon would bring preparation. This fight wasn't about 2 plastic barrels. It was about whether our association was a brand or a promise. And if it was only a brand, then this would be one more chapter in a long, ugly book of HOA nightmare stories. But if it was a promise, then we would find a way to make conservation look like what it is: care for a place we claim to love. In that moment, I decided to write the story like an HOA revenge story that ends with accountability, not fire. The fine notification hit my inbox at 12:22. $200, assessed to my account, payable with the next statement. The letter was brief, stern, and familiar. It referenced CCR Section 4.3 and reminded me of the escalating penalties for continued non-compliance. It also included a line about the appeal process: a door that looks open until you realize it leads back to the same room. I took a screenshot, filed it in my folder, and breathed through the sudden urge to haul the barrels into the garage. Then I opened my notes and began building the appeal I'd submit in parallel with the community push. You fight on all fronts when the other side holds the calendar. For clarity, I needed a single thesis: the association's ban on visible capture devices contradicts its own environmental claims and conflicts with the intent of the new state law. Every sentence after that would anchor to proof: brochure claims, agenda language, photos of controlled use, documentation of the clubhouse rain chain and barrel, and the law's summary. The treasurer likes neat packets. I would make mine a neat packet. I would attach the final notice dated May 12 as a structural template and underline how the board enforces speed for homeowners while moving slowly for itself. I didn't need to shame them, I needed to show them to themselves. By late afternoon, something happened that told me I had their attention. The agenda for the upcoming meeting went live. It included an item titled Rain Capture Devices, Policy Review. This was the board's attempt to move the conversation behind the meeting table without conceding enforcement. But the agenda was also public. I posted my one-page request as a comment under the item, polite and precise. Other residents added short notes about stormwater best practices. Someone linked to the city grant that once subsidized capture systems. The thread didn't explode, it filled steadily, like a barrel in a light rain, with evidence that our community was better than its reflexes. As evening fell, the garden strip darkened and the parking court lights clicked on with a hum. I stood by the barrels and listened to that hum as if it were the board's voice clearing its throat. I could feel the next moves assembling themselves. The board would say rules are rules. I would say missions are missions. They would say visibility matters. I would say water matters. They would say remove them for now. I would say align policy first. Tomorrow, I'd print the packet, walk into the meeting with my binder, and use their own process to make them blink. And if they didn't blink, then the battle would escalate. I had neighbors. I had photos. I had the board's rain chain captured in pixels. I had a timeline that added up. I'm not proud that I started counting money in my head. $200 a day is not catastrophic, but it's a number that grows louder with each sunrise. I planned my budget around the possibility of 3 days of fines, just enough to carry me to the meeting without caving. I told myself that even if I lost the early rounds, the optics of finding water conservation in a community that sold itself on green values would be a cost the board hadn't priced in. If they kept fining, the shame would become public. And if they reversed course, the money would sit like a moral receipt, a reminder that sometimes you pay to make a point. I made one more choice before the night folded around the buildings. I added a short line at the bottom of my forum post, a quiet signal to anyone watching this play out. Our community was not a stage for a Karen neighbor drama. It was a place where we could live up to our own brochures. I didn't name anyone. I didn't need to. The story wasn't about villains. It was about a board that forgot what its own words meant when they touched the ground. On my way in, I passed the clubhouse and watched a thin thread of water trail from the end of the rain chain into that hidden barrel. It made a soft ticking sound like a clock counting in reverse. The image settled in my mind like a prophecy. If they insisted my barrels violated the scene, they would have to explain their own. If they insisted the law didn't matter, they would have to explain why their agenda said it did. If they insisted on punishment, they would have to explain why the mission statement still had a leaf next to it. The night was clear. The walkway smelled faintly of wet concrete cooling under the lamps. I slept lightly, numbers moving behind my eyelids, but I woke with a steady thought. Tomorrow, the story shifts from my patio to the meeting table. Tomorrow, the board has to say the quiet part out loud, even if they're careful. And the minutes will keep the record, because a body like this lives in minutes more than in memories. I slipped the tag into my binder sleeve, set the fine notice behind it, and placed the agenda excerpt on top like a shield. The packet felt almost ceremonial in my hands. The clock was still counting. The water was still waiting. And I was ready to step into the room where rules are treated like scripture until someone reads them in daylight. I finally stood with my packet and used my minutes to offer receipts rather than rhetoric. I named the 3 parts of my appeal like points on a compass: alignment with our published mission, acknowledgement of the new state law's intent, and a temporary enforcement hold while policy was reviewed. I did not ask for forgiveness. I asked for coherence. Then I held up the agenda excerpt from last spring that praised conservation and handed the clerk a printed copy, evidence prop stamped by our own letterhead. I did the same with the city grant flyer, dated with a month and day and the blunt phrase, residential rain capture encouraged. I kept the tone steady, because in rooms like this, tone is a blade that can cut away your point if you swing too wide. The president thanked everyone and closed the comments. The board moved into discussion. They spoke in careful loops about consistency and interpretations, about the difference between permanent fixtures and temporary devices, about the risk of clutter. The treasurer mentioned liability, as if water were a lawsuit waiting to happen. Then, as if pulled by a magnet, the conversation returned to visibility like a compass needle. The sight of a barrel, they suggested, invited others to add more. The sight of control, I wanted to suggest, invited pride. The vote to maintain current enforcement until a policy review could be completed came quick and expected. The meeting moved on. I sat down with the mixed relief that comes when you get the outcome you predicted and hate the flavor anyway. The packet in my lap felt heavier with each item they rushed past. But something else landed with it. The minutes would show that the board acknowledged the new law and that the policy needed review. They would show residents asked for alignment. They would show the clubhouse's own chain and container were part of the record now. The board had not granted a stay, they had granted me a paper trail. Morning arrived like a clean page, and I filled it with edges. I printed the packet I had assembled, slid the yellow tag into the front sleeve, and clipped the fine notice behind it, a silent timeline pressed flat under plastic. I walked the path to the clubhouse with that weight tucked under my arm, listening to the faint buzz of the walkway lights clicking off, the way a stage goes dark before a new scene. The special agenda item was live now, visible to every pair of eyes in the complex. It would be discussed, recorded, and archived, which meant the association no longer owned the narrative alone. They would speak, and the minutes would answer back. I found a seat in the meeting room where the air always ran a little cold. The board took their places with practiced efficiency, papers in neat stacks, water bottles aligned, faces calm in a way that can read as either confidence or distance. The treasurer glanced over the crowd with a librarian's focus, counting heads without looking like they were counting. The president's posture said this was a formality, the room's hum said it was not. The management coordinator sat to one side with a laptop open, the cursor blinking over the draft minutes like a heartbeat. When they reached the agenda item, the treasurer read a boilerplate summary of current policy. External fixtures visible from common areas require prior approval. Storage devices are disallowed under CCR Section 4.3. The president added a note about uniformity and sightlines. The words were not cruel, only rigid. I set the packet on my lap like a shield I didn't intend to lift until the right second. The meeting format doesn't allow speeches, it allows comments within strict time. But I didn't need speeches. I needed the record. As comments opened, residents rose in turns and kept their voices even. The forum thread had done its quiet recruiting. People mentioned storm cycles, runoff on the sidewalks after summer squalls, and the cost savings we bragged about when sprinklers ran less. One person referenced a city program from 2 years ago that offered a $50 rebate for installing capture barrels with mosquito screens. Another mentioned that our clubhouse already had a rain chain feeding a discreet container behind shrubs. The treasurer made a note. The president didn't look up. Walking home, I took the long route past the prairie strip, where a breeze dragged a quiet rustle from the switchgrass. I stopped by the barrels, checked the screens and spigots, and considered the calculus again. Another $200 would tick onto my account by noon if I didn't move them. I could feel the number as a small burn at the base of my throat. I could also feel the shape of a trap collapsing behind me. Once I carried the packet to the meeting, there was no retreat that wouldn't read as surrender. The story had stepped past my patio and into the public ledger. I tightened the cap on a barrel and told myself the only way out now was through policy and light. On day 3, the fines stacked like chairs after an event. The management portal displayed them in a tidy column, each line tagged with a date, a code, and a link to the relevant rule. I took a screenshot and filed it as another receipt. Money is more than money in these fights, it is a signal the board thinks will make you tired. I did math at the kitchen table while the window let in a slice of clean sun. 3 days would be $600. 4 days would be 8. I could float it, barely, long enough to force a decision into the open. I promised myself that when the board finally aligned policy, I would not let them quietly reverse the fines without admitting what they had done. Neighbors didn't vanish after the meeting. A small group started walking the property with me in the evenings, not as a march, but as a slow audit. We noted where spouts cut trenches into mulch, where a corner always had standing water after storms, where a downspout spray soaked the base of a wood fence until it curved in slow surrender. We took photos to show the committee what water does when it's ignored. The treasurer thinks in spreadsheets. We would give them numbers and pictures that spoke the language of cost. A barrel is cheaper than repairing warped boards, cheaper than replacing washed-out mulch every season. I dug deeper into the bylaws after dinner one night and found a clause that had hidden in plain sight. The architectural review process includes a Section 4, temporary seasonal fixtures, described as items subject to different visibility standards during specific months when they serve a community function. The examples were bland, holiday decor, shade sails for the pool, but the words were useful. I highlighted them and printed that page as another prop. If a plastic snowman can be visible for 6 weeks because it fits a season, a barrel that holds the runoff from spring and summer storms should be eligible for at least a pilot period. Seasons aren't just holidays. They are weather. I submitted a formal architectural review request with photos, specifications for the barrels, and language that framed them as seasonal stormwater mitigation devices placed with safety in mind. I time-stamped the submission and included it in my appeal packet. The portal confirms dates automatically. The mailbox rule doesn't apply when the clock is digital. The act of submitting wasn't just about approval. It was about forcing the board to decide with a document rather than a reflex. Escalation didn't arrive as a shout, it arrived as a newsletter. The association sent a community-wide message that reminded residents about rules for exterior fixtures and storage, using a photo of a messy patio as its example. The barrels weren't pictured, but the timing did the talking. The letter used phrases like visual harmony and consistent aesthetics. It suggested that clutter spreads like moss if left in shade. It did not mention water, conservation, or the agenda item we had all just sat through. I read it twice and felt the temperature in the room drop a few degrees. This was image management, not problem solving. But the newsletter also opened a door it didn't mean to. It invited residents to submit ideas for eco-friendly improvements that align with our aesthetic standards. I replied with a proposal I had built from our walks: adopt a uniform barrel spec and placement standard, integrate them with plantings, and tie them to seasonal storm patterns. The proposal included cost comparisons, the city grant flyer, and a note that the clubhouse's rain chain and hidden container would be the visual baseline. I framed it as an update to policy rather than a rebellion. The treasurer likes updates more than apologies. If the board wants to keep charging me $800 to protect a sightline while our common areas keep paying for storm damage, I will make the price of that choice public, in numbers even a spreadsheet can't hide. The day after the newsletter, a second notice appeared in my mailbox, this one a reminder of continuing violation, with a line that hinted at accelerated penalties if I did not cure. The letter sounded like a drumbeat, a steady thud designed to shake resolve. I added it to my file and posted a short update to the residents' forum, keeping the tone even, sharing new photos of clean drainage around the barrels, and reminding everyone that my architectural review request was pending under the seasonal clause. In replies, someone shared a clip from our governing documents that mentioned pilot programs the board can authorize to test policy changes before full adoption. I smiled at the screen. A pilot is nothing but permission to try the present tense on. Meanwhile, I met one neighbor by the prairie strip at dusk and walked through the proposal again, making sure the language stayed humble and sharp. The air held a cool sweetness from damp soil releasing the day's heat. We circled back to the clubhouse and stood within sight of the rain chain. It ticked in the breeze, a thin song. The neighbor mentioned that the treasurer had been seen near the chain during the lunch hour, peering behind the shrubs. The association was looking at itself, however briefly. That's the moment you wait for, the flash of two mirrors facing each other, a corridor of reflection that's hard to deny. To ground everything in process, I scheduled an appeal hearing through the management portal, attaching the updated packet with the seasonal clause highlighted, the pilot program language, and a one-page comparison chart of repair costs tied to unmanaged runoff versus the cost of adopting a standard barrel spec. I added a line item for mulch replacement on 2 corners that wash out every storm. Numbers where suits to the meeting's words can't attend. The hearing found a different room and a smaller table. The rules were tighter, the faces fewer, the stakes higher by the inch. The president sat like a stone fence. The treasurer organized papers with a quiet rhythm that almost soothed until you remembered what those papers did when the votes were counted. The coordinator read the violation record into the file, line by line, like a slow metronome. I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth, a low, steady tide. I led with the pilot. A 90-day program to evaluate a uniform barrel design and placement standard. Placement behind privacy screens or shrubs where possible, if not, alignment against fences with matching neutral tones. Mosquito screens required, lid secured. Overflow directed onto soil, not concrete. I held up the city grant flyer again and the photo of the clubhouse chain. I slid the cost comparison table across the table and let the numbers speak in the treasurer's native tongue. The president asked, in general terms, whether allowing one exception would invite a flood of other exceptions. I answered with structure, a standard isn't an exception, it is a rule with teeth. I referenced the seasonal clause in the architectural review process and framed the pilot within it. The treasurer scanned the language and made a small mark on the margin, the way someone might mark a place in a book where the chapter begins to get interesting. The coordinator typed, the cursor hopping like a sparrow across the page. We broke after the presentation to let them confer. I stepped into the hallway where the light was gentle and the carpet smelled faintly like summer dust and citrus cleaner. A neighbor waiting to testify in another matter gave me a nod that said they had seen this dance before. I leaned against the cool wall and went back to math in my head. Another fine would hit by noon. The number didn't feel like a sum anymore. It felt like a lever. Pressure points do not move walls alone, but they can make the hinges creak. They called me back in. The treasurer spoke carefully, noting that the board acknowledged the need to review policy, recognized the pilot framework described in our documents, and would consider authorizing a limited trial. In the same breath, they said enforcement would continue until a formal vote. It was the association version of a half-step forward, admit the problem, hold the punishment steady. I left with my packet and an odd calm, like the air right before a storm shows its edge. So far, the board refused to pause fines, even while admitting the policy needed review and a pilot might be possible. I had the agenda record, the clubhouse rain chain, the seasonal clause, and the cost table, enough weight to make the next hinge move. I knew the next push needed to be visible in a way that wasn't loud. Social proof matters to boards that fear looking inconsistent more than being inconsistent. I drafted a resident petition, not a revolt, a request, asking the board to authorize the 90-day pilot under the seasonal clause, tied to the city's standards. I kept it to 1 page and 2 paragraphs, each sentence carrying one idea and one fact. I passed it on evening walks like I was lending a book. People signed with a steadiness that surprised me, about a dozen in the first hour, then more the next evening. Each signature was a small mirror turned toward the policy. By now, the story had the look of a storm stalled over one block, a slow, steady soak rather than a dramatic line of lightning. The fines kept arriving, the board kept talking in tight arcs, and the residents kept adding their names to the petition. I submitted the petition packet with a cover note that used the treasurer's own language, align mission with standards, reduce repair costs, protect sightlines with consistent placement. I included photos of the prairie strip right after a light watering from the barrel spigot, the soil drinking without complaint. That week, I noticed a subtle change in the way the board moved. The president started referencing stormwater devices instead of storage clutter. The treasurer used the word pilot without flinching. The coordinator added a line to the next agenda that read, consideration of seasonal stormwater capture pilot. The board was lining up the words it would need to step onto a new path without admitting the old one was a dead end. I didn't need an apology. I needed a vote. On the morning the agenda went live, I added one more piece to the pile, a short memo comparing our governing language to the new state water law's summary points, presented as a checklist with green check marks where we already aligned and blank boxes where we didn't. I didn't claim authority. I shared a picture that made the gap obvious. I attached the memo to the agenda item comments. It was, in its way, another evidence prop, the kind that makes a future reader understand the present without a footnote. Section 5 always starts the same way in my life, with a quiet decision made over a kitchen sink. That morning, I decided the board would not get to shape the optics alone. They had owned the clock. Now I would own the mirror. I printed the cost table at a size you could read from 5 feet away, and the city grant flyer, and a photo set of the clubhouse rain chain leading into the hidden container. I set them on a folding easel near the prairie strip during the community's Saturday coffee hour. I stood nearby but not front and center. I didn't need to pitch. The display did the talking. Neighbors drifted over, coffee steaming in the mild air, and looked without the pressure of a meeting clock. The images told a plain story: water captured here costs less than water ignored there. The treasurer walked by, paused, and read the cost comparison line about mulch replacement twice. They did not say anything to me, they didn't need to. The eyes told enough. I kept my hands at my sides and let the sightline do its work. By noon, I had collected a few more signatures and a few more quiet nods from people who don't write comments online but know what they're seeing when a policy fights a fact. The president kept their distance, talking to someone about pool keys, but I noticed their gaze travel to the rain chain photo like a moth finds a porch light. You can pretend something doesn't exist until a picture and a price tag stand next to it. At home, I set the easel by the window and sharpened the edges of my next move. The pilot vote would need a majority. The treasurer was already calculating costs. The president would need a face-saving frame. The coordinator would need tidy minutes. I drafted a one-sentence motion in the language our bylaws love: authorize a 90-day seasonal stormwater capture pilot, with standard device specifications and placement guidelines, to evaluate policy alignment with published mission and current law. It's not the kind of sentence that makes a movie. It's the kind that moves a lever inside a system. The board thinks this is about a pair of plastic drums. I'm about to make it about their reputation, in a room where silence will read like consent when the vote is called. The Saturday coffee hour bled into a quiet afternoon, and the air held the warm scent of sun on wetwood while the prairie strip buzzed softly with small wings. I took the easel down, packed the photos, and set the folding legs with the same care I wanted from the board when it handled our rules. The petition was heavier now with names, the cost table creased at the corners from hands that had traced the numbers. Retaliation isn't always noise, sometimes it's the slow pressure of receipts. I sent a final pre-meeting memo to the coordinator with the one-line motion drafted in bylaw language, attached the signed petition and the updated checklist against the state summary, and let the clock wind toward evening. If they wanted this to be about 2 plastic drums on my patio, I would keep widening the frame until everyone saw their chain behind the shrubs and the numbers on the spreadsheet. The crowd at the evening session flowed in like a tide that had learned the shoreline. It wasn't a revolt, it was a presence. The treasurer scanned the room and adjusted their stack of papers with that quiet editorial rhythm that always tipped the next scene. The president kept their eyes on the agenda, a habit that reads like focus until it becomes a shield. The motion for a 90-day seasonal stormwater capture pilot sat there as line 7, a sentence with hinges. I felt the steady level of stored resolve in my chest and reminded myself that a lever only works if you place it at the hinge. I began the resident comment period with 1 page and 1 tone. I pointed to the seasonal clause, then to the pilot section in the policy manual, then to the city's standards. I set the petition on the table so the clerk could scan the names without feeling pressed. I placed the cost table next to it, a visual argument that blended dollars with rain. I did not ask for mercy. I asked for coherence. The treasurer's pencil paused above the margin, then wrote something small near the line about mulch replacement and fence rot, a notation that looked like both arithmetic and acceptance. The board moved the meeting along the rails they knew. They took up budgets, maintenance tickets, and a small dispute about a door color that didn't match the approved palette. The room exhaled with the odd relief that comes when procedural gravity keeps everyone from floating away. Then the president read line 7, consideration of the seasonal pilot. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly, a soft current in the silence before policy moves. I watched the corridor of reflections open between the agenda and the photos everyone had seen that morning, and I set my hands on my binder to keep them steady. The discussion was more cautious than the last, and more practical. The treasurer framed the pilot as a cost evaluation tool and a way to standardize appearance, using my table as a reference point. The coordinator explained that the pilot could set precise placement rules and color standards, and that the architectural review portal could manage submissions with a consistent form. The president returned to aesthetics and visibility, but their words had less friction this time. The clubhouse rain chain had become the picture no one could unsee, the petition had become the room's conscience. The motion was read aloud in the clean voice of a sentence that knew what it was. If the vote fails now, the association won't just be fining me, it will be fining its own brochure, and the social shame of that mismatch will echo longer than any daily charge. A board member who rarely spoke raised a practical point about mosquito control, and I slid forward the device spec sheet with the screen requirement already highlighted. Another asked about overflow, and the placement guideline diagram answered with arrows towards soil instead of concrete. The treasurer checked boxes on a printout of the state summary, small green marks falling into place like evening rain tapping a railing. The president hesitated on the hinge between pride and prudence. Then the motion was called. The vote didn't crash like thunder, it clicked like a latch. 2 in favor. 1 opposed. The motion carried. The seasonal pilot was authorized for 90 days with standard specs and placement guidelines. Enforcement on existing devices that met the standard would be paused, pending case-by-case review through the portal. The room's ambient noise rose and fell in a gentle wave, the sound of people releasing breath they hadn't known they were holding while the HVAC exhaled a cooler line of air across the ceiling vents. I looked down at my binder and let the relief wash through without spilling into anything louder than a nod. The fix wasn't a trumpet, it was a map. The board assigned the coordinator to publish the pilot standards within 3 business days, with color swatches and placement diagrams. Appeals for fines during the pilot window would be reviewed under the new standard. The treasurer added a line about monitoring maintenance impacts and water usage where applicable, so numbers could testify when the 90 days closed. It was tidy. It was careful. It was also, in its quiet way, a reversal. The yellow tag in my binder lost some of its sting, but I kept it in the sleeve as a reminder that wins often look like paperwork. I walked home under street lamps that painted pale circles on the sidewalk, and the barrels waited exactly where I had left them, screens tight, spigots closed. I put a hand on the cool plastic and felt the stored rain answer with a faint internal slosh. The air carried the smell of cut grass from someone's afternoon chore and the thin metallic trace of the walkway lights. The pilot wasn't the end, it was the bridge to the end. 90 days can be a long time in a short fight, but a board that opens a door like this rarely slams it shut without thinking. My job now was to fill those days with proof, not noise. I filed the motion copy, added the vote tally to my notes, and drafted a post for the residents' forum that was humble and specific. The pilot standards would publish in 3 days. Anyone who wanted to participate could file an architectural review request with the standard form. The fines assessed during the pilot window were subject to appeal, and I included a screenshot of the line from the minutes so no one had to rely on hearsay. I attached the cost table again for anyone who hadn't seen the easel. No victory laps, only a path and a pace. Climax came on the 3rd business day, in the form of a published standard with the board's letterhead and the treasurer's measured prose. The PDF laid out the device spec, secured lid, mosquito screen, overflow routing, along with the approved colors and exact placement guidelines relative to privacy screens, shrubs, and fence lines. It recognized the seasonal clause as the policy spine and cited the city's summary as a reference point. And at the bottom, in a small but potent paragraph, it established that fines related to rain capture assessed since the pilot authorization would be held in abeyance pending review, and that prior fines issued within 10 days before the vote could be appealed on the basis of policy alignment. The fluorescent hum in the clubhouse's copier room must have been steady when that page came out. You could almost hear the board swallowing the edge of its earlier stance as the toner dried. I filed my appeal within the hour, referencing the pilot standard and attaching my dated photos, the agenda excerpt from last spring, the city grant flyer, and the cost table. I included the timeline, violation tag, mailbox rule letter, first fine notice at 12/22, hearing date, vote date. I didn't ask for anything framed as a favor. I asked for fines to be zeroed and for a written acknowledgement that my devices met the pilot standard. The treasurer likes clean ledgers. Clean ledgers demand corrections when the entries don't match the policy that now exists in the light. The appeal review took place in a small office that smelled faintly of paper and cold air drifting from a ceiling vent. The coordinator clicked through my packet while the treasurer checked dates against the minutes. The president stayed silent, reading the standard with a focus that looked different now that the policy bore their signature. Numbers moved across a screen, deductions replacing charges with small, neat animations the portal uses to signal corrections. The first fine zeroed out. Then the second. Then the third. The appeal decision would be formalized in a letter, they said with their procedural calm, but the ledger was already making the sound that matters most in an association, the quiet erasure of a punishment that should never have landed. The screen's glow made a faint halo on the edge of the desk. The letter arrived the next morning, fines rescinded under pilot alignment, account credited accordingly, compliance recognized under the seasonal standard, continued participation encouraged with periodic photo checks. It was not an apology. It was better than an apology. It was a record. The board had reversed itself in the only language that endures in these stories, minutes and money. The yellow tag in my binder had a partner now, a piece of paper that answered it line for line. I posted a short update to the forum with 2 sentences and a photo of clean water pouring from the spigot into a watering can by the prairie plants, sunlight catching the arc like a bright thread while the wind made a single stem of bluestem nod. No gloating. No names. Just a line about the pilot, the standard, and the ledger. The replies that followed were measured and kind. People filed their own requests. The thread became a quiet workshop where residents shared placement photos and the coordinator clarified details. The system, our system, had learned a new shape without breaking. Revenge, when it's good, isn't a spectacle, it's a standard. The board that fined me now asked me to help write the final report for the pilot, and I agreed with a condition so small it fit in a sentence, include maintenance data and a line about the clubhouse chain and container as the visual baseline that started this shift. They accepted. The treasurer set up a simple spreadsheet to log overflow incidents, mosquito complaints, and maintenance costs on corners that had been problems for years. The numbers stayed friendly. The prairie strip looked better. Puddles pulled back from the edges of the walkway after heavy rain, and the wood fence at the far corner held its line instead of bowing. The sound of storms changed from a warning to a resource. In the glow of a late storm's edge, you could hear water find the barrels with a clean, controlled patter. One afternoon during the pilot, a neighbor who had been skeptical walked the loop with me and stopped near the clubhouse. We stood where the chain ticked like a metronome over the container tucked behind shrubs, and they looked at it with fresh eyes. The board had treated that small setup like a decorative choice. Now it was a precedent. The pilot's draft report used it as a photo reference, and the caption beneath it was simple, existing capture feature installed prior to pilot, now integrated as standard example. The mirror had been positioned and left in place. If the board tries to slip past the final vote without a full acknowledgement, the minutes will wear the truth like a badge, and the community will remember who paid attention when water touched the ground. The final meeting of the pilot came with clear skies and a calm room. The treasurer presented the numbers, fewer maintenance calls on the worst corners, no mosquito incidents when screens were maintained, small savings on mulch replacement, and a minor but real reduction in runoff across the sidewalk near 3 units. The president, to their credit, read the report without rushing and asked a pointed question about long-term aesthetics. The coordinator responded with a slide showing uniform placement and color compliance. The vote to adopt the standard policy passed 2-1, with the president voting yes and the silent member from earlier abstaining this time. The policy moved from seasonal pilot to permanent option, subject to review each spring. The room's ambient sound felt warmer, like the subtle tone shift in a house when everyone agrees to open the windows. Aftermath isn't a parade, it's a maintenance schedule and a story you can tell without raising your voice. The fines that had appeared like a tally against my resolve were gone from the ledger. The pilot standard became policy. My barrels became ordinary in the best way, visible to anyone who looked but no longer serving as a symbol of defiance. They became what they were always meant to be, tools that keep water where it does the most good. The prairie strip grew into its spring with a richer green, the coneflowers promised their summer heads. The board published a brief post about conservation efforts aligning with aesthetics, and the sentence quoted the same mission line from the glossy brochure that had drawn so many of us here. I left the yellow tag in my binder as a cautionary artifact, and next to it I placed the letter that rescinded the fines. Those 2 pieces of paper tell the story better than any speech. They say the association can move if you place the lever on the hinge and apply steady pressure. They say social proof and numbers change more than a raised voice can. They say you can turn a small punishment into a larger standard if you refuse to be hurried into surrender. I watered the prairie plants that evening, and the air held that clean after-storm smell even though the sky was clear, a sensory echo that felt like closure. I also learned the shape of my own patience. This was never about winning a fight for the sake of it. It was about insisting that words mean something when they touch the ground. The association had wrapped itself in green language, and my quiet insistence forced those words to grow roots. That's the only kind of petty justice I trust, the kind that ends with better rules and fewer excuses. Tell me your rain barrel HOA horror in one line.